Hi, everyone. Valerie Williams here with the Converge Firm, kicking off our fourth episode for our podcast. Very excited today for our topic. Today, we're going to talk about DEI training. Okay, it's a big topic within our field, within our space. It's an element of every DEI strategy that we've put together. It's a really, really critical point when thinking about how to kick off your DEI journey as an organization. It's often where organizations start as well. We hear often about unconscious bias training as an example of a popular training that organizations often use. So we want to talk about, how do you think about DEI training? How do you develop a plan that's right for your organization? And so at the end of the podcast, we want to make sure you understand sort of the three elements of building a DEI plan around training. Okay, as a reminder, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, our YouTube channel. Check us out on social media as well. So, all right, let's jump into DEI training. At Converge, we think about DEI training in a lot of different ways, but we host a company-wide conversations within our clients, for our clients. We have self-guided courses through our Converge Academy. We host custom trainings and conversations as well. So I thought it would be helpful to just kind of go through, again, how do you develop a DEI training plan for your organization? When we think about training, I think about training in three different ways. First, training is about enablement. It's about enablement. How do we enable the organization to help reinforce our DEI strategy that we're building, right? Enablement is about skill building. It's skill building. How do we enable people to carry this work further? Two, I think about it in terms of education. How do we provide some foundational level education around DEI, around terminology, around these concepts that we're trying to monitor within the workplace and to promote within our DEI strategy? And then finally, it's really about learning. How do we foster an environment of learning within the organization, a culture of learning, so that we're knowing that on this DEI journey, that it's going to be a continual learning journey. Okay. So as we think about our training strategy, I want to talk about three areas. And you can even think about this as sort of three audiences or three areas for your DEI training program. Okay. First, let's talk about company-wide training. All right, so company-wide training is often where organizations start. It's really about, how do we elevate the collective cultural competence of the organization? How do we get the organization ready for this DEI journey that we're embarking upon? Okay, I mentioned in the beginning, unconscious bias training. This is often the first training that we hear that organizations will consider. The reason for this, and I kind of have a love-hate relationship with unconscious bias training for many reasons, but the reason that unconscious bias training is often where organizations start is because bias is so prevalent throughout the organization. It's so prevalent in everything that we do. It's the largest impediment or the largest blocker for DEI within an organization. If we don't have an awareness of our bias, if we don't think about how to mitigate bias within an organization, then our DEI efforts often can be stalled. Okay, so, but for company-wide training, I think when you think about foundational one-on-one training around DEI, something like unconscious bias, the goal is to build a shared level of awareness and a shared language around these topics. It's really about terminology. It's really about conceptual context for the work. It's really about building that foundational layer of understanding within the organization. Okay, and this is not just limited to unconscious bias. At Converge, we have a DEI foundations course that we put on that really starts at the beginning of DEI and talks about, break down what is DEI, what is the D, what is the E, what is the I, what are we really talking about around these concepts? So we have unconscious bias training, we have DEI foundations training, we have training around allyship. How do we show up as allies within the workplace and within our just regular lives as well? And we also talk about anti-racism. It is a foundational type level course where we talk about racism and how it shows up at work and sort of the history of racism in America for that lens as well. So again, company-wide training is sort of the first bucket of DEI training that you should have within your plan. Again, we're really just building awareness around certain topics with company-wide training. Let's not let's remember that the focus, the objective of this company-wide training is around awareness. It's not around changing behavior. Training in alone by itself does not change behavior, right? So back to our unconscious bias, conversation, it's really about building awareness around bias. And unconscious bias training alone is not going to change behavior in your organization, okay? So step one is around company-wide. Step two is really around how do we get more specific to different groups within our organization. So step two is about manager training and leadership training, okay? For this, the goal of these trainings is to set expectations of those behaviors that we're going into an expectation around behaviors within these trainings. They are more targeted to our populations, whether it is hiring managers or whether it's our people managers, as an example, or our leaders, our C-suite. It's more targeted to that audience. It's really meant to, again, start defining the behaviors that we want to see within the organization so that they can later be reinforced through our performance management systems, through our code of conducts, right? We want to make sure that the training is clear enough so people know what we're asking them to do and that we have some structures behind it to reinforce what we're teaching in the training. Okay. The reason that we focus on these populations is because your managers, your hiring managers, your executives, those are the people that have an outsized amount of power within the organization, right? They have a lot of influence within the organization. So we want to make sure that because these people have more stake in the game through their ability to influence and their relative position of power within the organization, that we have specific trainings for those populations to define the behaviors that we're expecting from them, okay? So that's our second group. The third kind of category of DEI training is really about how do we carry this work forward? How do we go from one-off trainings to more a cadence or an ongoing posture of learning, right? So I think about this last category as ongoing and self-guided training around DEI. So I mentioned earlier, we have Converge Academy that we launched that has a couple of courses around topics where you can go really deep in a self-guided, in a way that, you can carve out some time when you have 30 minutes or an hour break where you can just go deep on a topic so you could have a greater level of an awareness and understanding around a specific topic. Other ways that we help our clients think about ongoing learning is micro learnings. How do we send an email or a Slack message to remind people at critical times of different concepts? One example is during performance management during performance management time when we're having lots of conversation about performance, and how do we remind people of the typical biases that come up during that process? We might influence or send out a micro learning. Other sort of ongoing guides and trainings around this topic. So playbooks. We design a lot of playbooks for our clients, whether that is how do we hire? What is an inclusive hiring playbook? Or a communications playbook. How do we talk about this related to the communications framework, or one-pagers, resource guides, things of that nature that, again, enforce the learning that we've done in these other trainings, but that we're carrying the learning forward in our day-to-day, and we're operationalizing the training through playbooks and through defining how we might take these learnings into the workplace so that we're integrating the learning within the organization, okay? That's the last thing I wanna say about DEI training, is that training in of itself is meant to build awareness around topics. It's meant to set expectations around behaviors, but you you have to make sure that we are reinforcing the learning through our policies, our processes, and through these ongoing and self-guided mechanisms to carry the work forward, okay? So again, every DEI strategy should have a DEI training plan, a DEI education plan. So I hope that this conversation helped you think through what feels unique to your organization around DEI training. When you're first starting off, let's start with that company-wide training so that we're setting expectations, that we're building shared terminology, and then we can move into more custom training for different audiences moving forward. Okay, so we are excited to continue to use Converge Academy to be a place for education, a place for critical conversations around DEI. So be sure to check us out there, convergeacademy.com. We will continue to put out education through this podcast. So if you want to hear more about our workshops, definitely tune into our podcast. And of course, our social media is also a good place to just continue to learn and to hear more about our education offerings. So check us out, Converge Firm on Instagram as well. All right, we'll see you next time. Don't forget convergefirm.com if you want to reach us. And thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate the time to talk about DEI training. Have a good one.